This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. Many who are survivors of the Cold War era certainly recall these messages, and guests may recall fallout shelters and civil defense, all of which had already begun to phase out in the mid to late 1970s, almost 2 decades before the wall came down in Berlin. And now some 5 years have passed for most Americans since the beginnings of a global public health crisis. Pandemic is now in the rear view mirror, and much of life has accordingly begun to return to some semblance of what had formerly been the normal. Yet according to Statista, a trusted source for statistical data, as of May 2nd, 2023, the number of COVID-19 cases worldwide had reached over 687 million. And today, according to the World Health Organization, that figure has climbed to some 770 million. Quite large, with fatalities exceeding 7 million worldwide, while the United States had been the country with the highest number of confirmed cases and deaths, with fatalities exceeding 1.2 million, associated with around 104 million cases of infection. And most should be generally familiar with these facts, about which the World Health Organization had declared a pandemic emergency on March 11th, 2020, from which, by the first anniversary, according to the American president, the death toll amongst Americans had exceeded the fatalities in both world wars, the conflict in Southeast Asia, and the terror attacks on 9/11. In the United States alone, the total of tests, just tests administered to detect these infections attributed to the novel virus, had exceeded 1.1 billion. An effort in which community groups, churches, civic organizations, and state and local government had collaborated together to provide as a community service to all. Many most certainly had believed that they had been simply following the signs, and testing for infections may well have accorded with what some had accepted as simply common sense, and certainly may have appeared at the time to be the right thing to do. However, public health outbreaks are quite historically associated with fear, confusion, and despair. And during such times of traumatizing events and uncertainty, it is quite human to become fixated upon our feelings and not focused upon the facts. Perhaps you, in a sense of civic duty or even personal concern for health, had been one or more of the over 1.1 billion COVID-19 tests, or had assisted in their administration that had been administered, which were first authorized on as early as February 4th, 2020, when there were only a total of 7 known cases of COVID-19 amongst U.S. citizens, and over half of those at the time had actually been traveling abroad on luxury ships as tourists. Not one of around 5.5 million Americans, including some 330,000 military members and dependents who reside abroad, almost half in nearby Mexico and Canada for most Americans residing abroad. During the anthrax litigations, however, the concept of informed consent had been a central concern of the courts in America, which had, particularly for the military, galvanized support in the Congress, the elected representatives of the people, for the enactment of laws to prevent such abuses in the future. However, sometimes, sadly, especially in public health crises, those feelings and emotions overtake rationality, and sometimes even laws are broken, while some rights are deemed to be lesser in importance to assure public good of security and safety. Yet the Supreme Court of the United States in U.S. v. Schenck had stated in 1919, during the First World War, the war to end all wars, or so was thought, and during the winding down of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. Causing panic. It does not even protect a man from an injunction against the uttering of words that may have all of the effect of force. And almost a decade and a half before that, during a smallpox epidemic in Cambridge, not England, but Massachusetts, the Supreme Court had reiterated precedent from 4 prior cases in quotations, the oldest of which had been in 1887. If a statute purporting to have been enacted to protect the public health, the public morals, or the public safety has no real or substantial relation to those objects, or is beyond all question a plain, palpable invasion of rights secured by the fundamental law, it is the duty, the very duty of the courts, to so adjudge, and thereby give effect to the Constitution. It was Justice John Marshall, a Virginian, who had said it is the emphatic duty and province of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. But in that case, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, a case often referenced in public discourse during the COVID-19 pandemic for those involved in intellectual discussions, Justice John Marshall Harlan, at the very outset, had articulated a very basic rule in American jurisprudence, if not other nations. No power can be exerted unless it be found in some express delegation of power, or in some power to be properly implied therefrom. This is our most American rule of law. If it's not in the contract, you can't do it. Test time. We had a novel virus which had never existed before, regardless of its proximal origin, and there are many theories that abound, generally one of two. But all can agree on that it is new, and this had been the world's very first pandemic ever caused by a coronavirus. And so someone would have to develop a brand new diagnostic test for the brand new virus, which, as all know, had involved some level of cooperation with government in its COVID-19 pandemic response. Normally, medical devices and treatments are approved and regulated by the FDA, certainly something that all those engaged in the practice of law and intellectual property are aware. However, the elected Congress had been proactive and had enacted Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act to address a potential contingency such as this, in which previously unapproved products could be rapidly developed at warp speed to address such an emergency. And the Congress had expressly authorized only the Secretary of Defense, the Director of Homeland Security, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services to render a determination that an emergency had existed, but only in a total of 4 possible situations, all of which, however, only involved members of the military and citizens residing abroad, not the general public, who were, for these purposes, these emergency purposes, deemed less important than, to use the pandemic phrase, quite non-essential. Sometimes it is said it is easier to say sorry than to ask for permission, and perhaps in pursuit of a greater public good, like the 44% of Americans who now believe, even if some mistakes had been made overall, especially given that over 76% of the deaths were among the most vulnerable, age 65 and over, the government did the right thing. Let bygones be bygones. With 18% over that who believe the government actually should have gone even further. Permitting testing to the general public had been a de minimis infraction. So a few more people were able to find out whether or not they had COVID-19. What's the big deal? However, an emergency use authorization can only be issued under the FD&C Act, Section 564, if there is a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear CBRN agent or agents being deployed as a weapon of terror or mass destruction, again, presenting a heightened risk to the 5.5 million citizens residing abroad, about the population of Minnesota or South Carolina, and our military service members on active duty in the reserve component and National Guards, regardless of their location, and for which only 77% of age-eligible Americans are actually wholly unqualified to join, even as an infantryman. And so quite a few fall outside either of those categories. And so now, one question before the courts in the nation's capital is if the government lied about this weapon to address what most say, especially in the press, and some notable public officials, had been a highly contagious disease, which had naturally evolved or escaped from the lab, killed most of the old people, for which 1.1 billion tests had been administered. And if so, was this lying about a weapon the right thing for the government to do on February 4th, 2020, when there were only 7 known cases of COVID-19 amongst Americans, most of them traveling abroad on cruise ships? What does the science say? If we follow the science, is it a highly contagious disease or a weapon? That's a question before the courts. Surely you have been following the science, or you had been only listening to the news, who never quite got around to this little matter about the law. You look like an intelligent person, and this has been a test of the emergency broadcast system. If this was a real emergency, what would you do? The right thing. It's all academic. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.